Hey everybody, I just want to take a few minutes and talk about the assignments that are in the metaphysics unit. But before I get started on that, I just want to remind you about the idea of metaphysics and how it relates to the unit. You may recall from the branches assignment that metaphysics is the study of what is. So, how do we know things exist? At first that seems like a fairly simple argument because after all, you're sitting there looking at me, you assume that I exist because there's a video of me, you exist because you have your day-to-day life, you feel emotions, you move around in the world and experience things. But the earlier philosophers wanted to try to prove that. So for example, they would ask questions about how can you actually prove that you exist, that your experiences are real and not just dreams, for example. The early philosophers talked about the possibility that people were being misled or bewitched by demons. And later on, philosophers, when they moved past the idea of demons as being a realistic possibility, talked about the idea that how can you prove that you're not, for example, a brain that's floating in a pail of liquid that's being fed stimuli by a mad scientist? Odds are that you're not, right? But how can you prove it? That's the crucial point. The metaphysics unit is actually a fairly long unit, an important unit in the class. After this metaphysics unit, we're going to be right around midterm, and then we're going to have an epistemology unit. Epistemology is almost a branch of metaphysics. It deals with things like how do you know, what is truth, what is knowledge. Then we move on to ethics, which is a fairly long unit also. Finally, aesthetics, the nature of beauty, is a very short unit, and then the culminating assignment. No exam for this class, but a significant culminating assignment. So back to metaphysics. The first assignment in the metaphysics unit is kind of an opinion piece that asks you to discuss how you think dialogue, the nature of people talking with other people, has changed since Socrates' time. Now, you might think that the ancient Greeks walked around and talked about big ideas with each other all the time, but they were just as prone to gossip and vulgarity as anybody else. However, we do know from what's left to us, written down from the ancient Greeks, that there was a tendency for them to try to address publicly some of these big ideas. We don't see that as much anymore, although there are still some similarities. A lot of people, when they're doing this assignment, talk about the impact of technology. If you have any questions, by all means, let me know. That's assignment 1, part 1. Assignment 1, part 2 is curing logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are basically logical flaws in reasoning. Sometimes they occur by accident, sometimes they exist on purpose. And what you're asked to do is find a number of them. They're easy to find. If you search logical fallacies in Google, you'll find many of them. What you're asked to do is itemize them. So I'll use an example, the straw man fallacy. So you would say straw man fallacy, you would give a brief description of what the straw man fallacy is. Then you would give an example of how that fallacy or that flaw in reasoning might play out in life. And then using that same example, a cured version. So you would cure the logic. You would take out the logical fallacy or mistake. It's fairly straightforward assignment. It just requires you to do a little bit of research on the internet. Now, assignment 2 is major. That's the Descartes essay. I'm not going to say too much about it right now because I've got a separate video dealing with it. But you should know that it's a significant part of your midterm mark. And my advice to you is to not avoid it or procrastinate about it, but rather get right on it and do your best. Very rarely do people who let it go, come away with a good mark on it. It requires you to read the first 2 meditations, or Descartes' meditations, which were writings that he did about metaphysics to prove that he existed. And he finally comes up with his famous cogito, which is cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But before he gets there, he goes through a bunch of scenarios in which he talks about, possible proofs for his existence, and then ways that they don't actually count as proofs. So you have to read that first source, and you have to write a position paper about it. Again, I have a separate video all about that, and I'll be publishing that one shortly. After that, assignment 3 is called the Forbidden Thought Experiment. There are certain types of experiments that would be interesting to do, but can't be done anymore because they're unethical, I should say. Unfortunately, there are occasionally children who are abandoned by culture and society, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose, actually a lot of times on purpose. How do those children develop? Do they develop language? Do they develop religion? Do they develop an ethical sense? You can look at examples of actual children that have experienced being abandoned, becoming feral children, in other words. But the question really asks you, what is innate? It's sort of set up as a lab report. It's as if you're a scientist and you're observing this child that's been found in nature, and you're describing what the child is doing. But bear in mind, you're answering what you believe to be innate human characteristics. So, for example, would we come up with an ethical sense alone as creatures without involvement of any other humans? Is that something that's natural to us? That's up for you to decide. Assignment 4 is a short essay on the allegory of the cave. The allegory of the cave is a huge document in Western philosophy. It was written by Plato, and it basically expands on his idea of forms. The cave is, in effect, our reality, how we are blinded by our day-to-day, and Plato talks about how we poor slaves chained in this cave might emerge into the light of reason. You're asked to read the allegory of the cave, and then you're asked to answer 3 questions about it. What are the types of knowledge referred to in the allegory? It's fairly straightforward. What are the limitations of knowledge? That's going to require some thought on your part. And then, can you make a connection between that and your everyday life? There's a great example of a student developing that thesis in the content. You can look at that, and again, by all means, if you have some questions, let me know. Assignment 5, we skip to assignment 5, what is enlightenment? That looks at Eastern traditions of philosophy, their ideas of what exists and how people operate in the world. It's basically a chart. I'll give you an example of it, but where students go wrong in this is you're asked to answer it in point form, but people become very broad. Be specific in it. It doesn't have to be long, but it does have to be specific. Again, internet research, fairly straightforward as long as you're consistent with it, and as long as you follow the categories. So, for example, if you're asked to describe a number of schools of Eastern philosophy, it's comparative. So all of the headings that you use should be consistent from one school of thought to another. I'll give you an example again when we get to that part of the course. And finally, assignment 9, what is the meaning of life? This is a 2-part assignment, and sometimes people forget both parts. It's a 3-frame cartoon. I'm not evaluating your artistic ability, so you don't have to stress out about that. So you're going to submit a 3-frame cartoon that can be done either by hand or using an online software like Bitstrips to create, and then an explanation that accompanies it. So I need both of those parts to arrive at a mark for you, and obviously, the cartoon I'm expecting to be wonderful, but I also need to know what you were thinking about that cartoon when you hand it in. That's it. Enjoy. Good luck. Remember, any questions, I'm available. Talk to you soon. Bye for now.